As you continue your reading of Frankenstein and you move past the letters into the first 2 or 3 chapters, I wanted to offer you a little bit of some insights, maybe some passages to pay attention to. There's certainly a lot within this book that we can discuss and work with, but I just want to hit some of the highlights that are there. Um, One of the things I do want to kind of reinforce with you is this idea of this framed narrative that we've talked about so often, where you have stories within stories within stories. And I think this illustration here um, shows you more than anything how that is kind of set up. We start here with Captain Walton writing a series of letters to Margaret Seville, his sister. Okay. In doing so, he comes across Victor Frankenstein, who tells his story to Robert, who then transmits it to his sister. In the course of Victor telling his story, we also get the stories of his best friend Henry, his more than sister slash wife Elizabeth Levanza, and his brother William. And then we have sub-stories involving the creature, a character named Justine, and then a family named the DeLacy. So each of these are separate episodes that are housed within this larger work. So we're going to focus first with Victor's background story, where we learn a little bit about him, a little bit about Henry, and a little bit about Elizabeth as we move through the first 3 chapters. All right. So chapter 1, which is the beginning of the book, as far as like Victor's story of it, begins with a very simple sentence: "I am by birth a Genovese, and my family is one of the most distinguished of that republic." And then he goes on to explain like all the prestige and offices that his family has held. So he is not, just some guy off the street. He has a little bit of a legacy, a little bit of a reputation, a little bit of a family, and he's known. Okay. But then we get a curious sentence here in this first opening page: "As the circumstances of his marriage illustrate his character, I cannot refrain from relating them." Here he's talking about his father, okay, and how his father had a best friend named Buford who had some bad luck in business. Businesses fell apart, and rather than suffer the embarrassment and shame of bankruptcy, he just decided to move himself and his daughter, a young girl, out of the area. And so Victor's father lost touch with them. Alphonse lost touch with them. Now, as the story continues, we get our first look at a curious term. It's a literary term called Deus Ex Machina, which literally means God from the machine. And this is a Greek device. And what it used to involve was the Greeks, if they got themselves in a part of their play or story that was way too complicated, they actually had a machine that would lower a figure onto the Greek stage, and that figure was a god, and the god would wave his hands, and suddenly a miracle would happen, and whatever plot complication was present would suddenly disappear and dissipate. Mary Shelley is going to use this device quite a bit. It's very similar to you as a young person writing a story, and you can't find yourself a way to get out of the plot, so suddenly you wake up from a dream, and that somehow resolves and answers all questions. We have that instance here as we look at Victor's father searching for his best friend, okay, and learning that the friend has moved and he's desperately trying to find him so he can rescue him. And we learn a little bit about Victor's mother, a woman named Caroline Beaufort, who is the daughter of this bankrupt Beaufort, okay, and how she worked. She was not a common person. She had courage. She supported her adversity. So she is strong. She's always been a strong woman. Several months passed in this manner. Her father grew worse. Her time was more entirely occupied in attending him. Her means of subsistence decreased, and in the 10th month her father died in her arms, leaving her an orphan and a beggar. This last blow overcame her, and she knelt by Beaufort's coffin, weeping bitterly when my father entered the chamber. He came like a protecting spirit to the poor girl, who committed herself to his care, and after the interment of his friend, he conducted her to Geneva, placed her under the protection of a relation. 2 years after this event, Caroline became his wife. So there's a huge age difference between them. He's an old man. She's a teenager. But this part here, where the father is dying in her arms, and as she's weeping over his coffin, miraculously, Alphonse Frankenstein comes onto the scene and rescues her and sweeps her away. This is what we mean when we call it a Deus Ex Machina. So Victor, of course, grows up. As we read later, he has a very special, privileged life. He's the eldest child. Okay, he was born in Naples, and as an infant, accompanied them on their rambles. So the parents like to travel a lot. He remained for several years their only child, and much as they were attached to each other, they seemed to draw inexhaustible stores of affection from a very mine of love to bestow them upon me. My mother's tender caresses and my father's smile of benevolent pleasure while regarding me are my first recollections. I was their plaything and their idol, and something better, their child, the innocent and helpless creature bestowed on them by heaven, whom to bring up to good, and whose future lot it was in their hands to direct to happiness or misery, according as they fulfilled their duties toward me, with this deep consciousness of what they owed towards the being to which they had given life. So it's going to be curious that Victor has fond memories of how he was so idolized by his parents, but yet his own creation, his own child, this creature, he abandons, and it disgusts him. So we'll see later that he explodes this entire family upbringing of being an adored child and central. And the idea that the parents have made him their idol is a little bit blasphemous. And then we move on to another rescue story. So just like Caroline Beaufort was rescued by Victor's father, Alphonse, we learn in this, as the chapter unfolds, we learn that Elizabeth is also an orphan who is going to be, I guess the word is adopted, but it might be better like stolen. She's a beautiful girl, and Victor's mother, Caroline, just becomes enchanted with her and basically just takes her away from the family that's raising her. And so we get that in this passage here, if you want to look through it. Everyone loves Elizabeth. She's so passionate. She's so beautiful. She's like an angel with blonde hair and blue eyes, and she's just a beauty to everyone she's surrounded by. This is the part that I want to look at. So if you're going to eventually, if you decide to write a paper about women in Frankenstein, this might be a passage you want to look into. Victor's attitude toward this girl, who is about his age. She is, well, let me use Victor's mother's words, okay? Victor's mother says, "I have a pretty present for my Victor. Tomorrow he shall have it." And when on the morrow she presented Elizabeth to me as her promised gift, I, with childish seriousness, interpret her words literally and looked upon Elizabeth as mine to protect, love, and cherish. All praises bestowed on her I received as maid to a possession of my own. We called each other familiarly by the name of cousin. No word, no expression could body forth the kind of relation in which she stood to me, my more than sister, since till death she was to be mine only. This obsession and possessiveness of Elizabeth, he sees her, it's almost like the mother has picked her out of the crowd to be Victor's future wife, and she certainly does nothing to discourage that. She will encourage that and continue to tell the children that they're going to get married someday, they're going to get married, and of course that's what winds up happening. Forget the fact that this is idolatry more than it is maybe romantic love. So as we move into chapter 2, we begin to see Victor talking a little bit more about himself, and we see his view of the ideal childhood that he had. No human being could have passed a happier childhood than myself. My parents were possessed of the very spirits of kindness and indulgence. We felt that they were not the tyrants to rule our lot according to their caprice, but the agents and creators of all the many delights which we enjoyed. When I mingled with other families, I distinctly discerned how peculiarly fortunate my lot was, and gratitude assisted the development of filial love. So Victor understands how lucky he is when he sees other families. At this point, he has an adopted sister, okay, Elizabeth. He is going to have two brothers also, as well that are born in the family. So it's a nice little family of 4. Now, this is telling this next sentence. My temper was sometimes violent and my passions vehement, but by some law in my temperature, they were turned not towards childish pursuits, but to an eager desire to learn, and not to learn all things indiscriminately. So Victor talks about having a violent nature, which is certainly going to be true as we look through the book later, but he turns it toward education. Unfortunately, he has a very poor education. As we learn a little bit about Victor's reading list, he's fascinated by alchemy. And he talks about how I was a great degree self-taught with regard to my degree in studies. My father was not scientific, and I was left to struggle with a child's blindness, added to a child's certain thirst for knowledge. Under the guidance of my new preceptors, I entered with the greatest diligence in the search for the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, but the latter soon obtained my undivided attention. This elixir of life. Now, it's going to be very unclear like how Victor makes this creature, but early on, he seems interested in creating life, the secrets of nature. Now, there's an episode that happened in this chapter. And we see it here. When I was about 15 years old, we had retired to our house near Belri when we witnessed the most violent and terrible thunderstorm. It advanced from behind the mountains of Jura, and the thunder burst at once with frightful loudness from various quarters of the heavens. Now, I'm going to drop a little kernel of information for you. Vic, this is not the first thunderstorm that's going to happen. The term we talk about in literature is Sturm und Drang. It's a German phrase that means emotional storm as well as physical storm. And you'll see that Victor is very much affected by the elements of nature, particularly lightning storms. And again at key points in the story, lightning's going to be happening. These huge, massive thunderstorms will roll through as Victor's going through some of the bigger events in his life. And then as Victor beholds, as I stood at the door, of a sudden I beheld a stream of fire issue from an old and beautiful oak tree, which stood about 20 yards from our house. And so soon as the dazzling light vanished, the oak had disappeared, and nothing remained but a blasted stump. When we visited the next morning, we found the tree shattered in a singular manner. It was not splintered by the shock, but entirely reduced to thin ribbons of wood. I had never beheld anything so utterly destroyed. So this is the point where he realizes and becomes fascinated with the laws of electricity. That's why often we put electricity with the creation and the creation scenes, because we think this was an early influence on Victor. We have further look at Victor's motivation. It was the secrets of heaven and earth that I desired to learn, and whether it was the outward substance of things or the inner spirit of nature and the mysterious soul of man that occupied me, still my inquiries were directed to the metaphysical, or in the highest sense, to the physical secrets of the world. Then I want to close with this overly dramatic. This is where we have an instance of Mary Shelley being a young, immature writer. So here is the death of Victor's mother. Elizabeth had caught the scarlet fever. Her illness was severe, and she was in the greatest danger. During her illness, many arguments had been urged to persuade my mother to refrain from attending upon her. She had at first yielded to our entreaties, but when she heard that the life of her favorite was menaced, she could no longer control her anxiety. She attended her sickbed. Her watchful attentions triumphed over the malignity of the distemper. Elizabeth was saved. But the consequences of this imprudence were fatal to her preserver. On the 3rd day, my mother sickened. Her fever was accompanied by the most alarming symptoms, and the looks of her medical attendants prognosticated the worst event. On her deathbed, the fortitude and benignity of this best of women did not desert her. She joined the hands of Elizabeth and myself. My children, she said, my firmest hopes of future happiness were placed in the prospect of your union. This expectation will now be the consolation of your father. Elizabeth, my love, you must supply my place to my younger children. Alas, I regret that I am taken away from you, happy and beloved as I've been. It is not hard to quit you all. But these are not thoughts befitting me. I will endeavor to resign myself cheerfully to death, and will indulge a hope of meeting you in another world. She calmly died, and her countenance expressed the affection even in death.